Nyali Banjalangni Rakol Jugun Nyali Gani Garama Mala Jugun.
We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Banjalang people, on whose land Mullumbimby stands. We offer our deep respect to the elders past and present for their knowledge of how to live in harmony on this ancient land. Okay, so I'm very honoured to introduce Kate Veitch, and she's going to act as the chair tonight. And she's been involved with books and authors most of her working life. She's also the author of 2 novels herself. One's called Trust and one's called Listen, and both published in Australia by Penguin. And also she's done a number of essays for the Griffith Review.
I'm Kate Veitch, and I'm very pleased to be chair of this session, Writing in the Neoliberal Age, and to introduce to you our wonderful 3 panellists here. Jim Hearn, Gillian Rubinstein, and Melissa Lucashenko. Jim and I do also, and Melissa, all 3 of us, not yet Gillian, she will, also write essays for Griffith Review. This is one of their most recent editions, Fixing the System, and it's got an essay by me in it, at least, called Stuff, Why Do We Own So Many Things? I wanted to mention that because I wanted to begin my remarks by reading to you a bit from an address that Griffith Review's esteemed editor, Julian Schultz, truly a force to be reckoned with in Australian writing. She recently gave the Brian Johns lecture. She begins by telling this story. A couple of years ago, Julian Schultz met Amazon's man in Midtown Manhattan with a view to having the quintessentially American enterprise publish articles from her quarterly magazine out of Queensland, the Griffith Review. He told me Amazon would be very interested in publishing the pieces we generated. There were just a couple of issues. We'd need to Americanise the essays, preferably with American examples and locations. Amazon would have to publish first. There would be no advances or guarantees about income or placement. Finally, as I prepared to leave, he asked, "We can work with either, but what is your currency, the euro or the US dollar?" Welcome to modern-day colonialism. In Julian's lecture, she called for urgent national action to ensure Australia's cultural institutions and ideas survive in what she termed the age of FANG. And that's an acronym for Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. I looked at those 5 and I thought, yep, I've used all of them, and some of them I use on a daily basis, some not so often, but they have absolutely permeated our lives. Julian makes the point that these handful of global companies are shaping tastes, distributing and exploiting information. We haven't yet got our heads around what it might mean and how it might play out. What we do know, though, is that technology companies have figured out how to make money in an unprecedented way from the marriage of technology and culture. As a result, we are seeing a massive redistribution of wealth from the cultural sector, where meaning is created, to the technology sector, which has figured out how to market, distribute, reach and make money in ways the cultural industries never imagined. In the process, they are creating a new world which produces unprecedented wealth, yet which gives us enough of an illusion of choice and being in control to feel we are free agents, global citizens even. Just after I read that, I also read, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but I did read it on Facebook, A wonderful British writer, Jeanette Winterson, has just been here for the Sydney Writers' Festival, and she gave a talk which has been reproduced, but you can Google it. This is what Jeanette said. Art is central to our lives, to the dreaming, imaginative life. Art is not a luxury. It really matters. It is the core of being human, because creativity is the core of being human. Why can't we have childcare and healthcare and education and funding for the arts? Why can't we? Austerity, it's not true. It's a narrative and a fairy story. Art, it's real. It speaks to your soul. Arts have got soul because we have got soul. We meet on the steps of a story. The more language is in you, the more language can come out of you. The more you can create your world, the more you can challenge your world. Once you have the language to challenge authority, you have power. Yes. So, let's proceed. Our three speakers, as I said, our three writers, our three powerful people here, we'll each talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll ask you to join our conversation. We'll begin with Jim Hearn. Jim is the author of High Season, a memoir of heroin and hospitality, published by Allen and Unwin in 2012. Jim's a regular contributor to Griffith Review and is a winner of the New Philosopher Writers Award. He holds a PhD from UTS and teaches creative writing at Southern Cross University, Lismore. He's going to be talking about how neoliberal policies have become entrenched at SCU, particularly in universities more broadly, and what's at stake for the arts and humanities when that's the case.
Neoliberalism is a very specific ideology with a very specific aim. Its aim is to turn what we think of as the nation state, that is Australia and other nation states, into what we think of as a market state. And there's very specific ideologies, as an ideology, there's very specific technologies and policies that seek to enact that aim. When we think of the nation state, we think of liberal democracy, or we think of a secular democracy. We think of this state with a bunch of citizens who have certain rights and responsibilities, and the state essentially functions by and for the people in what we think of as a liberal democracy. In that world, it is not a crime to have what we think of as public institutions. It's not a crime to discuss, the sort of public good of educating young citizens, of ensuring that our children are literate. It's not a crime to think and talk about public health as something that, unless it's run like a corporation, lacks any sense of purpose or, reason for being. Every free trade agreement that's ever been signed is a very specific technology that seeks to turn what we think of, and I love that FANG analogy, or an acronym, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google. I don't have a problem with what they're doing as in terms of redistributing creative content so much as I have a problem with they don't pay tax. And they don't pay tax because they have more sovereign authority, more power in what we think of as a globalised world of market states, whereby they have rewritten the rules of where true authority lies. True authority in what we think of as a neoliberal world exists in law courts that don't pertain to nation states, outside of very particular and specific issues. But the way and the reason they don't pay tax is because of free trade agreements, because that's the reason for them. And they exist with an authority that is beyond what we think of as the nation state. Now, I think the other very, very important thing to say about this is that if it worked as an ideology, I would vote for it. I would be all for it. If it made the world a better place, I would be sitting here advocating for it. Because I'd like to think I'm not an ideologue or I'm not. I mean, as a citizen, I believe my power is as a swinging voter, and I vote power out. And I always like to talk about that. And I have no particular ideology to sell myself, but this idea that it is a good ideology, we only need to look at America, which is a country not so much a couple of decades further on from Australia in terms of neoliberal evolution as several legislated policies further ahead. It is a country that is $16 trillion in debt. That $16 trillion is owed by the nation state, by the citizens. It is public debt. It has gone to the 1% and 2%. It has been the most massive transfer of wealth away from the people and what we think of as a nation state, and indeed the Commonwealth, to that 1% and 2%. This idea that it's a good thing just needs to be evidenced against the fact that America's middle class has been absolutely decimated. They don't have a public health system. It operates at 3 times the cost of our health system. It is extraordinarily inefficient. But all these things in a neoliberal world are thought of as good and as exemplars of how we turn the nation state into a market state. Because this is a bit I don't get. You got idiots like Tony Abbott and conservative politicians who are essentially middle-class public servants their whole life, with 6 months as a journalist or something. Their whole life they've been a leech on the public purse, a bit like myself as an academic, yes. But they sort of, their whole raison d'etre is to kind of destroy what we think of as a nation state in order to please the 1%, the Rupert Murdochs of the world. What do they think they're going to get out of this? They are never going to belong to that class of people. That's the bit I don't get, because Tony Abbott's family suffers as citizens of Australia the more we become a market state, and the evidence is America. We don't need to be geniuses or writers. We just need to be activists and logical and rational about why these policies don't work, how they've failed citizens, and how we must speak to what it is, a very specific ideology with very specific aims. And those aims are bad and poor and do a disservice to citizens all over the world. And they have done this by Greece. I mean, you just load up a country with their sovereign debt. It's just been bought out by the banks. It's now owned by what we think of as it's a market state. The IMF and the World Bank own Greece, completely own it. They have no sovereign authority in the country they own, and that's just an extension of neoliberal policy. That's a good thing because it makes a certain clique of people much wealthier, and it's all public debt. The idiot taxpayers have to pay it all back, and it goes to bail out the banks and the bankers and the industrial arms race. The 16 trillion in America, I mean, every child born in America is born into $50,000 worth of debt. And that is after 530 odd years of colonisation. I did my PhD in cultural studies because I'm fascinated with developing a more sophisticated understanding about how the world works, about my place in it, about why human beings do the things we do. And when we talk about writing and the value of writing, we also have to talk about the value of the arts and the humanities very broadly. Creative writing is a discipline in what we think of as that secular institution at the core of liberal democracy, the university. The science isn't interested in Mozart, the fact we can produce music. It's not interested in the fact that we write poetry and novels and have imaginations that create fantasies. But of course we are, and we must be. And we must put a value on the idea of writing and thinking and talking about the art, all the arts, and how neoliberalism is an abuse of the very idea of what the human condition is capable of doing and being. We are so much more than consumers in an economy. It is such a bad idea to think that in any way, shape or form that's how we should be. It is absurd.
I've never studied creative writing. I don't think Gillian has, or Melissa, no. But Jim has, and he teaches it. And I want to know how that is working in a neoliberal system.
Well, very quickly, I can tell you the specific policies in terms of how it's understood in the university context is that, I'm employed as a casual. Over half of 50% of the teaching is done by casual academics in Australian universities now. It's the second most highly casualised sector of the economy. Beyond hospitality, so that was ironic for me, as someone who moved from a chef into academia. The logic is entirely budget driven. If there's not so many students in a class, if the class gets cut from 2 hours to 1 hour, you get a contract one day before the semester starts, you're paid every minute of labour, and they're not, they have no ongoing responsibility, you're sacked at the end of every semester. These are examples of how there's a pervasive logic and indeed a normative acceptance of the idea that our public institutions have to be run as corporations. The only thing that's happened during the prevalence of that is that the bureaucrats and the managers have shifted an enormous amount of financial resources toward themselves to the detriment of everything that happens below. This is the most depressing thing that for me, as how I saw neoliberalism entrenched at the university, and not just creative writing but everywhere, was the idea that 39 of Australia's 40 vice-chancellors voted yes to Christopher Pyne's free market liberalisation of the sector. 39 of Australia's 40 vice-chancellors gave it the big tick, 100% privatisation, all set your own fees. You know you've lost. Or what you know is not that you've lost, that you know it's dominant and you know it's normative, and that we have to actually become activists. We have to take back the power of being a citizen, literally, and we have to explain the absurd nature of this ideology to everyone. To our children, to my students, to people we meet. We have to write about it. We can write about this. For me, I write about this very critically and theoretically, but it is an abuse of power. It's the most really pervasive abuse of power in our times, in terms of how it permeates the quality of everybody's life and lived experience. Yes.
Thank you, Jim. Gillian has been a full-time writer since 1986, when her first novel, Space Demons, was published. She has written books for children of all ages, as well as novels and plays, and has known all the triumphs and disasters of the writing life, the unexpected successes and awards to the unforeseen flops and failures. With a mixture of luck, timing and risk-taking, she achieved a mid-career revival, changing name and genre to become Gillian Hearn, international best-selling author of the Tales of the Otori series and other fiction set in Japan.
As Kate said, I have been a writer for over 30 years now and have known all the ups and downs of the writing life. At the moment I'm on something of an extrovert period. I had a book published in March. It's now coming out in the States over the next few months, and the second volume will be out in Australia in I think it's September, with publication in the UK in August and next February. So I'm now in this sort of extrovert phase of having to do things like, I thought I would write down what I've done this week. So I did an interview with Wired magazine on innovations in publishing. I wrote a piece for my own blog about dressing up in Japan with photos. I wrote a piece for somebody else's blog on small beginnings, on how I started writing as a child. I had to rewrite another essay on the snow country. I had to respond to a discussion with my American publishers, Farrar, Straus, Giroux, on a sort of round table. I had to agree to set up some Skype book groups with America. I had lunch with my UK publisher, who flew up to have lunch with me. I then interacted with fans on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram all the time. 3 weeks ago I went to Perth for the SwanCon conference, and then the next week I went to Adelaide for a seminar, and I accepted an invitation to Supernova in November. So I've had a very busy few weeks, and that is the upside of the writer's life. When you're in demand, everybody wants to talk to you, and it's very exciting. But of course, before that, the actual writing of the book, for this book, Emperor of the Eight Islands, I had the first idea early in 2010. I began writing in 2012. I'd finished my handwritten draft in 2014. That's 2 years of writing every morning from about 5 a.m. till 7 a.m. because that's when I do my best writing. 6 months to type it into the computer, which is my second draft. I sent it to my agent at the end of 2014. I did another rewrite after talking to her. It went to publishers early 2015, editing and rewriting all through 2015. So then it was out in 2016. So the whole process of writing a book is a very long time. And of course, it's a sort of gamble, because you never know if it's going to be a success or not. I've had books that I absolutely love to death, which haven't sold very well. And there's no way of knowing beforehand. Nobody knows. Accountants always say to publishers, you'd do fine if you'd only publish bestsellers. And of course, the publishers say, if only we could. When the book comes out, it is a kind of hiatus in your life, and then you have to go through this very weird stage, which, as Kate says, is like the FANG process, when you have to put yourself out there, and I think most writers are introverts, and then you have to turn yourself into this extrovert. You have to go out and sell yourself on social media. You have to get over the insecurity and the self-doubt, because our society values success and financial success above all. It doesn't really like authors to appear to be vulnerable. It likes to see its authors being successful and self-confident. So that means that we find ourselves trumpeting every little achievement, every good review on Goodreads, every time our sales go up a little bit on Amazon, every mention on Twitter. We're walking this fine line, which is really staying alive, but also hanging on to integrity, maintaining generosity and resisting envy. Otherwise, we run the risk of falling into that self-obsessed, self-serving delusion. So I'll just go back a bit. I am published in Australia by Hachette, which is now a big multinational. I'm published in the States by Farrar Straus Giroux, who are now owned by Pan Macmillan. And I'm published in England by Pan Macmillan, although, of course, it's a different publisher from the American one. So when I wrote this book, everybody got together, the 3 major English language publishers, and they sort of tried to plan their marketing. So the first thing they decided was that they didn't like my titles. So they decided they would retitle them, and they decided they would call the book Emperor of the Eight Islands, and the second one is called Lord of the Darkwood. My early titles were The Autumn Princess and The Stag in Exile. And I then changed some of my titles. I always find it very hard to find titles, and I then called them The Spider Tribe and The Tengu's Game of Go. And I'm glad to say that my final title is going to be the title of the 4th book in the American series, so I won 1 out of 4. But when they decided to change the titles, I could have said, well, I don't really like this idea at all, but I decided to go with it and to put some energy into their decision and to make them feel that they had a say in the creative process, because most publishers love to feel that they are equally creative with their authors, and sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. And so I thought that I would put the energy into these titles and go with them. So anyway, that's how it ended up. Then we came to the editing. They decided to save my sanity that they would just give me one editor and everyone would go with the Australian editor. When I started writing, I was very lucky in that I did get a lot of support from the Australian government through the Australian Council and through the through Arts SA, and I would always be enormously grateful for that funding, because it not only gave me the ability to only write for 2 or 3 years, it also gave me enormous confidence in myself. And I think this is the thing that funding does to artists. It's an amazing verification of you. It confirms that you're right in your choice of a career. And I think that I probably paid all that back in tax over the years, so I guess that we are about equal now, the Australia Council and the various government grants and me. When I started writing in 1986, it was more that you would get a small advance, that your books would sell by word of mouth. The gatekeepers like librarians and English teachers were enormously important. And I think that that has changed tremendously. I had a very good publisher, first of all, Highland House, which was one of the smallest independent publishers in Melbourne, with a very gifted editor, Anne Godden. And I really miss those days when Anne, I knew I could trust to edit a book, and whatever she said I really did listen to. Now, so much of the author's life is kind of made up of irrelevant details. Choosing an appealing photo, doing a little segment on where I work, making sure the house looks beautifully tidy and the cat's looking nicely posed on the bed, talking about your lifestyle, or if you have a trauma, it'll be so much better, and can you base it on a true story? If you're young and personable, not hard to look at, as a publisher actually said recently, so much the better. So the book and the author are being turned into a commodity. How many units can we sell of this? Unfortunately now BookScan gives an immediate answer to how many units are being sold. BookScan is the thing that tracks every single book sale. Not quite everyone, so you can always say, well, it's not all books, you know, that show my book only sold 30 copies last week. There was some sold that didn't show up on BookScan, you know. So I think authors now have to curate their own life, which is a weird feeling. You have to choose your photos very carefully. What do they say about me? What will my followers on Instagram think about this? Are my posts showing me as a serious and yet approachable person? Advances have certainly shrunk. Agents have to work much harder at trivial things. Everyone is expected to do more for no pay. There are more books than ever being published. Other options disappear. More and more people want to create employment for themselves by becoming writers. And there is far more opportunity for them now. Creative writing courses abound, there's self-publishing, and the promise of the huge break is always there. Just to have a novel accepted is indeed a huge achievement. But what nobody tells you is that from then on it's 99% disappointment. The disappointing sales, the dismissive review, or no reviews at all, and the publisher who no longer takes you to lunch, who stops returning your call, the long slog at the next book. Is it all worth it? How can I stand out in this overcrowded field? But that is the gamble, and that's the thing that we love about it, I guess. It's feast or famine. We do it because we love it. And I couldn't finish without mentioning the other side of the coin, reading. This week I've read the most incredible novels. Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore by Robin Sloane, Hild, a novel about the 7th century saint Hilda by Nicola Griffith, Sharp Teeth, a novel in verse about werewolves in Los Angeles by Toby Barlow, Lagoon, a novel about Lagos by Nnedi Okorafor, The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen, one of the best books I've ever read on the Vietnam War, Exposure by Syed Kashua. One of the great ways to understand the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is by reading his novels. So even though there is a lot of rubbish, there are celebrity memoirs, ghost-written books, and all the other cheap dross. But there are also amazing works with absolute feast for readers with more and more diversity. So that's my little snippet of life and writing in the neoliberal world.
When Gillian mentioned the support that she had from the Australia Council and from Arts South Australia, you may be aware of what has happened to the Australia Council very recently. Small companies, theatre companies and performance companies of all kinds and magazines were decimated, a lot of them, no funding whatsoever. This is all thanks to George Brandis. The changes that he made over a year ago have now, in this round of funding, come into being. What's not so well, hasn't been quite so well publicised is that grants to individual artists, and that's mostly individual visual artists, painters or sculptors, and especially to writers who all work individually. The number of grants given has been cut by 70% from one year to the next. What this will mean for the writers who are developing now, for what we will see in Australian writing, who will be able to afford the time to write, and what we will be able to read in 10 years' time. It will be a very changed landscape, and I would echo Jim's words here about we need to become activists and to protest this and to do all that we can to draw this to attention and to support writers. Melissa Lucashenko is an award-winning Aboriginal novelist who lives between Brisbane and the Bundjalung Nation. Melissa's most recent novel, Mullumbimby, was awarded the 2013 Deloitte Queensland Literary Award for Fiction, won the 2014 Victorian Premier's Prize for Indigenous Writing, and was longlisted for, I love this one especially, for both the Stella and Miles Franklin Awards, as well as for the Dublin Impact Literary Prize 2015. That would have been a cracker to them. And may I say, it is a cracking read. It really is. Melissa, and I have many. Melissa said that writing is itself a cure for the neoliberal diseases of depression and loneliness. Melissa.
Thanks very much, Kate, Jim and Gillian, the organisers. It's great to be back on Bundjalung Dargan again. I live in Brisbane these days for various complicated reasons, some economic and some not. When I hear talk that we're in a new era, an unheralded era, I think of what Euripides said, and he said there is nothing new under the sun. I think there's always been greed. I think there's always, in the Western tradition, been poverty. There's always been exclusion. And we could talk about that till the cows come home, but really a better topic might be, what are we going to do about it? And becoming activist is certainly one part of the answer, I think. You know, Hamlet said, the question is, well, he was talking about suicide, but he said the question is, you know, whether to take up arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. It's a question I've wrestled with all my life, is whether or not violence has a place as a response to the body politic. Because the powers that be will push and push and push, and until we push back, things aren't going to change. We saw that under the Abbott government, you know. The 2014 budget, I don't know how many of you saw that image of Joe Hockey smoking a cigar and congratulating himself and actually doing a little dance to some song in the back rooms of the Federal Treasury after bringing down a budget that would have seen young people literally penniless for 6 months if they were unemployed before they were eligible for the dole. And when I think of that image, I think these people do actually inhabit a parallel reality. Someone during that year, it could have been hockey, or it was someone in the federal Liberal echelons, was asked what people were supposed to do if they found themselves, you know, desperate and poor, unable to make ends meet, unemployed. And this person seriously answered that those people maybe should think about selling some shares.
It's time.
It's time. How long do you continue to talk? You know, what can peaceful action do and what can't it do? I think, you know, if we cut to the chase, this is actually the question. Throughout the millennia of history, people have always fought for change. People have always fought for equality and justice, and we can sit here in the warmth of the pub and eat a nice counter meal and, you know, bemoan the state of the world. But I have to go back to Brisbane partly because I can't afford to live in Byron Shire, where my mother's people have lived for 40 or 50 or 60 or 80,000 years. You know, a lot of the economics is complete bullshit and propaganda, but some economic facts are real, and some economic facts have to be fought in a very pointy way. Okay, I was going to talk about the atomisation of the Western family, but I've had a big day and a very strange day that I have to be careful not to talk about, so instead I'm going to read you 2 poems and then I'm going to shut up. This is Ali Cobby Eckermann's Circles and Squares, and I read this in London, I think it was last year, and I read it in front of Alexander Downer, who's the Australian what's-her-name over there, because he's from South Australia, but mostly because it's a bloody brilliant poem. Alright, Circles and Squares. I was born Yankurijara. My mother is Yankurijara. Her mother was Yankurijara. My family is Yankurijara. I have learnt many things from my family, elders. I have grown to recognise that life travels in circles. Aboriginal culture has taught me this. When I was born, I was not allowed to live with my family. I grew up in the white man's world. We lived in a square house. We picked fruit and vegetables from a neat fenced square plot. We kept animals in square paddocks. We ate at a square table. We sat on square chairs. I slept in a square bed. I looked at myself in a square mirror and did not know who I was. One day, I met my mother. I began to travel. I visited places that I had already been, but this time I sat down with family. We gathered closely together by big round campfires. We ate bush tucker, feasting on round ants and berries. We ate meat from animals that live in round burrows. We slept in circles on beaches around our fires. We sat in the dirt on our land that belongs to a big round planet. We watched the moon grow to a magnificent yellow circle that was our time. I have learnt 2 different ways now. I am thankful for this. That is part of my life circle. My heart is round, ready to echo the music of my family, but the square within me remains. The square stops me in my entirety. So I guess if we can try and see the squares in the lies that we're told and try and remember the circles that bind us together to our friends and our family and to strangers that we don't know and to the planet and to the animals, the waters, I guess that's a pretty good place to start. This is an Aboriginal poem about economics by a poet called John Burke, who's a Wiradjuri man. And he was commissioned to write a poem for an APEC meeting possibly in Darwin, because he's lived up in Darwin for a long time. He may be down south again now, I think. And it's a poem, you would all have heard the term payback, yeah? Payback is thought of in the mainstream imagination as a kind of eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth system of punishment, or sometimes it's something more random and chaotic and dangerous than that. And in some of its modern manifestations it might be that, but Aboriginal law prior to colonisation was not a simple thing. It's a sophisticated set of rules, as Justice Blackburn said in the Yarrkala case in, I think, 1971. He said it's a government of laws and not of men, by which he meant it was a good thing. And John Burke in this poem is talking about payback, but he's talking about it in the complex and sophisticated system of laws that originate from the Yolngu people. A poem for the APEC ministers. I write, between the essays and the towels, the sun kissing me this day, beneath the jacaranda glowing, while the wind is coolly warm and blowing from Brazil. The machine's efficient Japanese, computerised, and the Irish linen greets the breeze, its blessing true, for through polished mango groves it comes behind my back, playing with my drum from Holland. May the middleman know the meaning of Beata. My students have done well on Taiwanese computers, typing things like, I did not know all this before, and your readings are awakenings. Not this before. And could it be that when the first thorned tree was planted in our land, that someone in Brazil got rich? Or that the Irish flaxers did not pay taxes to their English overlords and enjoyed their day in the sun uninterrupted? May the middleman know the meaning of Beata. And could it be that smiling Japanese gave me my white goods for a fair and just reward? The Macassans came and went and came and went, and Yolngu traded in the sun with no one rich and no one poor, and the good earth all intact. It is a fact they trade women, words and bêche de mer in a way I can only guess, and yes, they had their fights with foreigners on nights beneath the tropic moons, but then too soon the others came, digging holes, driving beasts. May the middleman know the meaning of Beata. My students have done well and tell me of Ujaru, who told them that we are going and the Bora ring is going and the rich are getting fatter. May the middleman know the meaning of Beata. I am glad of the Irish linen drying all the day and appreciate the fine machine which, unattended, spins away while the fridge is cooling New Zealand wine, and the blood-red flowers look so fine and make me want to smile marking essays, but they, the students, speak of massacres and death in custody and even worse, like slavery here. My great-grandmother was a slave. And blood-red rapes and even worse to my people and yours. And because we can't forget, we get it that trading was and is the way of men, all green and glowing seas, bringing pearl shell, tree trunks for canoes, and across the land ochres, rich red and white, were used, all yellowed with their age and stories. Seas are dying, seas have died. May the middleman know the meaning of Beata. Let those high-flyed men who in a New York tower or Sydney harbour home with bowers of exotic fruits and flowers from they care not where know the meaning of Beata. merely playing, they sip fine wine and taste the feet of peasants who drink the dregs. The men in towers taste their tea spiced with tears of slaves within the fields who have their day in the sun every day. For what pay every day? For what pay every day? Well may all men know the meaning of Beata. The footnote says Beata, a Yolngu word which translates nearest to a fair and equitable compensation for something already transacted. Beata can also mean payback.
Let me just read you one part of a sentence that Melissa may have forgotten that she included in her email to me a couple of weeks ago. The tool of literature is now raised in battle against a much more difficult opponent than ever before.